Hey everyone, welcome to today's virtual seminar here at LDI, which is Achieving Global Vaccine Equity for COVID-19. I am Rachel Werner. I'm the Executive Director of the Leonard Davis Institute of Health Economics. We are here in the U.S. It seems like we're turning the corner on the COVID-19 pandemic, with over a third of the U.S. adults having received at least one COVID-19 vaccine. The infection and death rates have declined dramatically, and it seems like we're beginning to return to life as we knew it before the pandemic. However, in low and middle income countries, it's a different story, where access to vaccines remains far below what it is here in the US, with dire consequences and substantial loss of life. As we speak, wealthier nations are starting to try to address this global vaccine shortage, and the Group of Seven is meeting and just announced a plan to donate 1 billion COVID-19 vaccine doses to poorer countries. But some say that this plan is too little, too late, and shows Western leaders are not yet up to the job of tackling the worst public health crisis in a century. Today, we are very lucky to have with us a tremendous group of experts to discuss this important issue, what the U.S. and other wealthy nations can do in the short term to increase global access to vaccines, and how the U.S. can alter its response to meet current COVID-19 needs and future pandemic preparedness goals. Now, I would like to introduce the panelists. We do have one last-minute change in our lineup today, as Tel from IMAC was unable to join us this morning due to a last-minute conflict. But luckily, Tahir Amin, the co-founder of IMAC, gamely agreed to jump in at the last minute, and we are very appreciative of his flexibility. So Tahir Amin is a health justice lawyer and co-founder of the Initiatives for Medicines, Access, and Knowledge, a nonprofit building a more just and equitable medicine system. He has more than 25 years of experience in intellectual property law and now works to reshape patent law to better serve the public. Jennifer Cates is Senior Vice President and Director of Global Health and HIV Policy at the Kaiser Family Foundation, where she oversees policy analysis and research focused on the U.S. government's role in global health and on the global and domestic HIV epidemics. David Robinson is Deputy Director at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. During the COVID-19 pandemic, he has co-led the COVAX vaccine manufacturing SWAT team and participated as a member of the COVAX vaccine manufacturing and supply chain task force. Before his time at the Gates Foundation, he spent 25 years at Merck working in the area of vaccines. Today's panel will be moderated by Harsha Thormurthy, who is an associate professor here at Penn in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy, doing research at the intersection of economics and public health. He studies behavioral interventions to promote health outcomes in low-income settings and also has evaluated large-scale disease prevention programs in low and middle-income countries. Welcome, everyone, and I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that introduction, and also thank you to LDI and the Penn Development Research Initiative for co-sponsoring this virtual seminar. Before I begin, I'd like to also thank Mavis and Jazan behind the scenes at LDI for all of their help. And I also want to recognize Anushree Singhvi, a colleague, for her support in helping me coordinate today's seminar. Anushree she's a principal consultant at the Latham Biopharm Group and has many years of expertise in the pharmaceutical and public sector. She's also serving as an external consultant to the Gates Foundation on COVID vaccine development efforts. So very grateful for her support. And finally, I'm grateful to our panelists for being here today. I'm really looking forward to this to a spirited discussion about today's topic. And Rachel has already done some of this, but given the daily news headlines regarding the pandemic, there's not a lot I need to do to set the stage for what we're going to discuss. As of this week, we've had 175 million reported cases of COVID-19 worldwide, 4 million deaths. Very grim numbers, of course, but also very likely to be underestimated. And despite the progress we're seeing in high-income countries, in many low and middle income countries, there's been little to no access to vaccines, and many of them are facing a very severe crisis. India, of course, has been experiencing a very deadly second wave, as many people are aware. It has overwhelmed its health system, and sadly, India is not an exception. There are many other low middle income countries on all continents that are experiencing very similar surges in cases. So we know that vaccines are going to be essential for bringing an end to the pandemic. And I think the point that's really crucial and the one that's motivated today's discussion is that it's going to be crucial for ending the pandemic, not just in the countries that are facing a crisis now, but also here in the US, despite the progress in vaccination coverage. As President Biden himself has put it recently, there is no wall that's high enough to keep us safe if the pandemic is raging in other countries. And importantly, as an economist and global health researcher, it's also worth noting a WHO report that was released earlier this year that vaccine delays in poorer countries also stands to reduce global GDP by over $4 billion. So this includes $2 billion in GDP losses in high-income countries alone, just to disruptions due to disruptions in global supply chains and materials. So I think it's especially concerning that in many low-income countries so far, fewer than 1% of people have been vaccinated. Of the 1 billion doses that have been administered globally, far fewer than 1% of those doses have been administered in low-income countries. So despite a lot of the encouraging actions in recent months, I would say even recent days, as Rachel mentioned, we're a long way from the more than 11 billion doses that are needed to end the pandemic. So what I'd really like to focus on today is how can we ensure that the billions of people worldwide will be able to get swift access to COVID-19 vaccines. What specifically is the role of the U.S. or what can the U.S. and other wealthy nations do to increase access to global COVID-19 vaccines? That's what I want to talk about with our panelists today, who bring just a very diverse and relevant amount of expertise to this topic. And I'd like to jump in then with a question first addressed to Dave from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, focusing on COVAX. So a lot of the discussion about vaccine access in low middle income countries has centered on COVAX. This is an initiative aimed specifically at equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines, being directed by Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and the World Health Organization. So, Dave, I'd like to ask you, could you tell us briefly about how COVAX has gone about obtaining vaccines for global distribution, given that there have been so many developments on the supply side, including yesterday at the G7 summit? How many doses of vaccines are currently available through COVAX? How does that compare to the estimated need? And in your opinion, given your in-depth knowledge of COVAX from the beginning, what are the important challenges that COVAX is facing?
When you think about COVAX, you have to realize that at the very beginning of the pandemic, there really was no global organization set up to really respond to and deliver vaccines globally. There were various organizations who had bits and pieces of this. So one of the first things that was done was to form what's called the Access to COVID-19 Accelerator, Act A, under which COVAX sits. As you know, it's really Gavi, CEPI, and WHO and UNICEF who are the primary members of that. And the mission there was to really find a way to procure vaccines and distribute them equitably. And at the heart of it, it's really a risk-sharing mechanism, right? For the very wealthy countries, it's quite clear that the very wealthy countries could afford to invest in any of the, at that time, there were probably 30 candidates in development. Now there's well over several hundred candidates in development. But the wealthy countries could afford to invest in multiple different vaccines. But the less wealthy countries really couldn't afford to invest in that many. They'd have to pick and choose the best candidates, may not be able to make investments. So it was a way to both do risk sharing for countries. They could buy into a pool of vaccines, as well as having pooled procurement. So it's a risk sharing mechanism. And almost 200 countries signed up for this, almost every country in the world signed up to be a part of COVAX. And COVAX has shipped doses to 129 countries, including the 90 poorest countries in the world. The procurement mechanism basically has worked by expanding the role of Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines, and UNICEF, who pull and procure vaccines traditionally for the poorest countries in the world, and now to do this for all countries in the world. To get to your question about dose production, how many doses have gone there, you'd estimate, the moderator said that about 1 billion doses worldwide. Depending on how you look at it, I've seen estimates of 1.6 to 2.2 billion doses have been produced worldwide. And again, estimates there'll be 6 to 8 billion doses by the end of 2021. Of that, 82 million doses have been distributed as of this week via COVAX. And so that number stands in stark contrast to the number of doses that have been developed worldwide. And as we know, as was pointed out, the U.S. vaccination rate is 30–40% of the people have been fully vaccinated in the United States, less than 1%. When you look, for example, at sub-Saharan Africa. So there's clearly a need to get more doses into COVAX and to get more distribution. And the effort, the recent statements by the G7 of donating 1 billion doses from the U.S. government, of donating 500 million doses, is going to be extremely helpful and extremely important, because what we do know is that the high-income countries have, in many cases, again, since they didn't know which vaccines work, they placed contracts with multiple vaccine developers and manufacturers. In many cases, have actually secured enough vaccine to vaccinate a population 3, 4, or 5 times over. So donating those excess doses is extremely important, and it's really gratifying to see the activities that are taken there. And this is probably something that Jenny's going to cover in more detail later, so I'll leave it there.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Dave. Jen, let me turn to you about the role of the U.S. specifically, both on the global stage and also specifically with regard to COVAX. I think a few weeks ago, the Biden-Harris administration announced that the U.S. would be sending 80 million COVID-19 vaccines abroad, and then yesterday there was this announcement about the U.S. purchasing and donating, or intending to purchase and donate, an additional 500 million doses to low middle-income countries. But I'd love to get, given the expertise you have in the U.S. global health support, how has the U.S. supported COVAX until now, and how should we be thinking about donations? Like, in your view, are there additional ways that the U.S. should be supporting COVAX? How should we think about increased funding versus donations, or are there other forms of support that you'd really like to see the U.S. providing in this pandemic?
Great, thanks for the questions, and it's good to be here. So, I want to step back a little bit and remind everyone where we were, let's say last fall. COVAX had already been formed, as Dave was discussing, and the prior administration, the Trump administration, was decidedly sitting it out and did not want to be, was sort of sitting out the global stage more generally, but certainly on COVID, and said it was not going to join COVAX. That's important because even though we're going to be focusing on donations and funding, what the U.S. does and doesn't do, whether it's at the table or not, does have an impact. So I think it's just important to remember that was the stance up until the new administration. So soon after President Biden took office, within the day, he announced that the U.S. would join COVAX formally, and did. So that's the first thing. I think it's important to note. But it's also important that it's not just what a president does. Our Congress has actually been trying, I think, for the last several years broadly, but certainly with COVID, to find a way to support a global effort. And right at the end of last year, it passed emergency funding that provided $4 billion to COVAX, making the U.S. the single largest donor to COVAX still. So that's pretty significant. That actually happened before the Biden administration. That was a prior thing that occurred. So now here we are today, as you mentioned. The Biden administration had announced 80 million doses to be shared, and then lo and behold, this week was this great announcement that I think everyone what was a surprise to me. I didn't necessarily expect it coming. The 500 million doses and of one particular vaccine of Pfizer, and that's enough to vaccinate 250 million people. And then if you add in the 80 million other doses, which is additional, that's, depending upon what vaccine mix, it's probably close to another 40 million people. So it's significant. It certainly doesn't get to the levels that Dave talked about that are needed, but it is a significant bump. One thing to your question about, is money important? Are doses important? When the announcement came out, it wasn't clear what that funding, where that was coming from. And what we now know is that the U.S., as part of its $4 billion contribution to COVAX, had already provided $2 billion to COVAX and said, we're paying into this now. Here's your $2 billion to use. We'll have the rest of it coming. It's actually, the Biden administration made a decision to use that $2 billion to pay for these doses now. So instead of providing that cash, is using that cash plus some additional funding to buy doses. So it really does raise this question, I think, right away. Is it better to do that? Is it better to do the cash? And I think, there's different views, but from my understanding, what the administration decided to do, it'd be good to hear Dave's perspective, because I also believe that the Biden administration was in discussions with COVAX about this. But one of the challenges that's occurred is that rich nations are buying up doses, as we all see. The U.S. has bought doses. EU countries have all bought doses, the UK, and it's making it really difficult for COVAX or others to make deals with manufacturers. So one thing that buying doses, as the US just is saying it's doing, it can do, is get through that logjam and say, we're buying these doses, we have them, and quickly get them to COVAX to distribute. So it's not bypassing COVAX, it's actually providing the doses directly. So I think that will mean that it will be speeding up the process and delivering Pfizer vaccine, which is important from what we know about variants. So you can make an argument that is an efficient, quick way to deal with a very big problem. And maybe we can talk about that. But in terms of the bigger question too, like what more can the U.S. do? I think watching what the Biden administration is doing at the G7 right now by making that announcement right before it does up the ante for other G7 members to come to the table, and they are. And so that's a big way in which any administration, particularly the U.S., can play a role.
Right. Jen, thanks, Jen. And I have one very quick follow-up for you, which perhaps others can take on later as well before I turn to Tahir. And that has to do with the discussion around donations and who makes the decisions about where the donations go. And so with this latest announcement, do we know whether the donations will be going through COVAX? And if not, what are some of the pros and cons of some bilateral decision-making on donations? Could you perhaps tell us a little bit about that briefly, and then I'll turn to Tahir.
Sure. It's a great question, because an issue that's come up is, how are these donations being used for political means or for, quid pro quo or for other motives here. And in this particular case, the Biden administration has said, nope, we are giving these doses, and in fact is giving them to COVAX to distribute through the AMC, really to the mechanism within COVAX that provides doses to the poorest countries, the 92 countries that are in need. So it's going, and as far as I understand, it's going to be completely within the COVAX determined process, the countries that are eligible, and the U.S. is not going to have a say anywhere, to give more here or give more there. And I think that's important, because it says it puts trust in the institution that was created to distribute the doses, while maybe speeding up the process to get the doses there. So that's my understanding. It's different from the 80 million doses that the Biden administration had already announced, some of which it's going to be channeling in a bilateral route.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much. That's one thing I was wondering about with this new announcement. So Tahir, I'd love to turn to you next. We've been speaking a lot about COVAX and about donations until now. I want to ask about issues that are related to the patent system and the World Trade Organization's role in all of this. And I think it's just worth noting, or I'd like to mention to our audience earlier this year that you and your colleagues at IMAC had prepared a list of 10 steps that you'd like to see the Biden-Harris administration take towards bringing equity to our patent systems, I think domestically and internationally, particularly with a focus on the U.S. Patent Trademark Office. So in light of this, I'd like to get your reactions to the Biden-Harris administration's announcement, I think it was last month, that it would support a World Trade Organization waiver of intellectual property protections on COVID-19 vaccines. I think the proposal was first made by India and South Africa. We've spoken about donations, so I'd love to see your feeling about sort of what the implications would be. What are the likely implications for global access to vaccines if this waiver were adopted? And to what extent do we need to be pushing hard on the waiver as our way to increase, to achieve increased supply versus a lot of the discussion at the G7, which is centered on the number of doses that countries will be donating? So perhaps tell us first about the waiver and your reactions to that.
Right. So for those of us who've worked in the intellectual property space for the last 20 years in relation to public health, the United States has always sort of resisted any waiving or relaxing of intellectual property rules. We've had this through the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the late 90s, early 2000s, even within the TRIPS agreement, which is part of the WTO agreement that governs intellectual property rules. There was even a big struggle to even get what we call the Doha Declaration, which was a declaration that in public health emergencies, countries could actually avail themselves of certain provisions in order to override patents or in terms of public health emergencies. And so even those were big battles that happen, and in every case, the US and the Europeans have resisted any relaxation. So for the Biden and Harris administration to actually come out and say they supported a waiver was a real significant shift historically in terms of where the US has usually stood on these positions. And we have to recognize that. But on the other hand, what we're seeing is the European Union, the European Commission, actually now sort of saying they don't actually agree with the waiver, and there's a few other rich countries that are resisting. And so just sort of pulled back from that sort of announcement, it's what we're seeing is this. I think now the negotiations are happening. I think this week there were 2 meetings that were happening, and this proposal, the original proposal, as you said, was put forward by India, South Africa, and there were 7 other countries, and then it was eventually the Pakistan's included in that too, and then there are actually now 59 actual sort of sponsors of the waiver, and there's some over 100 countries, many low and middle income countries, supporting it. This was actually put forward in October 2020. So the Biden-Harris administration's announcement came for some 7 months later. And we're still now dragging our feet. And remember that this waiver is not just about vaccines. It's about all medical technologies that can be used to tackle COVID-19. We've seen at the beginning of this pandemic sort of PPE equipment, diagnostics. We've seen ventilators. All this stuff has intellectual property on it. And what's been interesting also is the World Health Organization created this pooling mechanism, which was called a way of actually getting technology in. It's called CTAP. Technology would be put into the pool by patent holders or other IP types of IP. Because remember, IP is not just about patents. It's about know-how. It's about trade secrets. It's about copyright. It's about all these assets that can go into any of these technologies. And so this is a voluntary mechanism, which was supported by Costa Rica, and there's none of the companies about put any technology into. It's a year later. And what's really interesting, so this is the voluntary mechanism. And what's really interesting is like the amount of gaslighting that the Europeans have done on this, or even others that have resisted the waiver, is now saying, oh, we should use voluntary mechanisms. Well, they were there a year ago, and nobody's done it. And so what it is really to avoid anything really, to do anything really significant vis-a-vis the WTO, because intellectual property in the market model for the medicine system is so problematic when it comes to pandemics that nobody wants to change the system. And I think it's worth viewers understanding the way the WTO was created. It was imposed on the lower middle income. It was created at the behest of pharmaceutical companies and the copyright industries in the 70s and 80s. And here we have now a situation where, as these countries were playing catch-up technologically, they were essentially there was a ceiling that they hit because all these intellectual properties started flying around and they couldn't develop their capacities. That's the only reason why India developed so far as a generics producer and all its other capacities, was because it actually didn't have these IP rules until it joined the TRIPS agreement. And many other countries were like that too. So, and what we're doing again now in this situation, we're not learning from history, is we should be relaxing those rules, because there are a lot of other manufacturers out there that could have the capability and capacity to build up and do some of these manufacturing. Now, of course, it has to happen with some technology transfer and know-how that would help speed up this thing. But, given projections where, you talked about the vaccine numbers that are available and doses, even though there's bullish estimates that the companies, the current manufacturers, can actually get some 15 billion doses by the end of the year, they'd have to double their output at the moment based on projections. So the idea of the waiver is to get as many suppliers in and build it up. And, COVAX is essentially, it's a purchasing mechanism. It can't purchase things that aren't there. And so the idea is to build a manufacturing around the world globally and not rely on this donation system, which, frankly speaking, which is, I don't want to sort of be controversial, the TRIPS agreement was a kind of quasi-colonial system, and this donation system is a quasi-colonial sort of way of addressing public health crises.
So thanks for sharing your thoughts on that, Tahir. And I think it's a good jumping off point to open up the discussion to other panelists to weigh in on some of the issues we've been discussing. And so perhaps just picking up on this last question, one of the things I've been wondering is that when the announcement was made by the U.S. Regarding the WTO waiver, I wondered what else needs to happen for that announcement to actually translate into expanded supply. And Tahir started to speak about some of that, but I'd love to get perspectives from others as well, Dave and Jen. In the near term, what do you feel needs to happen for some of the if there was this WTO waiver put into place, what needs to happen for the leading obstacles to expanding supply to be removed? And we've heard about technology transfer, but are there other things you wonder about? And I've also seen some discussion about just how long it will take to even get the waiver through the WTO. So just let me perhaps turn to you, Dave, first, but welcome other people to speak on this too.
No, but thanks very much. So one aspect here is the foundation is very focused on getting increasing vaccine supply. We have supported for a number of years vaccine manufacturing capacity expansions and continue to help in countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, and so forth. Even though we said that's still insufficient, right? That really still is insufficient. So it comes a little bit to closing comments as we have to build up more vaccine manufacturing capability, because we have unfortunately seen what many people have referred to as vaccine nationalism playing a big role here. So that really is very important. But we also need to be, I think, realistic about this. I think the activities that are taken for the HIV antivirals and retrovirals were very extremely important and have turned out to be extremely helpful and critical. Unfortunately, vaccines are much more complex to make, and I know that people always hear that statement, so let me try to just give you a visual around that. If you take the standard small molecule drug, it could be the statins, it could be the antivirals, these probably have a molecular weight of about 200 Daltons, and that just gives you an idea of size. It's so big, right? 200. An antibody, which you've heard about and have been used for therapy, it has a molecular weight about 180,000 Daltons, so it's about 1,000 times bigger. When you get to some of the more complex vaccines, and we take, for example, the human papillomavirus vaccine that's been used very successfully in the U.S. and around the world to have a big impact on cervical cancer, that has a molecular weight of about 20 million Daltons. That means it's 100 times bigger, and I'd argue corresponding more complex than antibody, and you're looking at something it's like 10,000 or more times bigger and more complex than a small molecule. And all these have to be made as sterile products, so it means they require specialized facilities specialized skills, and those aren't built up everywhere. So one of the things we really need to do, unfortunately it takes a long time to do it, is to build up the facilities and the skills, workforce training, in the areas that are most in need of vaccines. And this is something we'll embark on, but we just have to be cognizant of the fact that it unfortunately takes time and effort.
Mm-hmm. Jen, do you have a view on this too, like following this WTO waiver, or once we get there, what needs to happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the take-home message that I think we all need to recognize is there's not a single solution here. There's, this is going to be multiple. There's donations needed, there's financing needed, there's relaxation of intellectual property laws, there's manufacturing boosts, and through all the methods that we've talked about, and that's complicated and is going to be tough because keeping the sort of donors especially, but not just, sort of focused on a multi-pronged approach is going to take effort. On the WTO piece, I would just say that given what we know, the tension that's come up, that's another place that the U.S. can play an important role. If the U.S. coming out with a position early, well, not early enough, but maybe early, the Biden administration coming out with a position supportive early, and at this point, there's discussions that the Biden administration is likely having with the EU right now about this, and that's a pressure point there that I think is important and not to forget. But really, we're all focused a lot on the donations, on the number of vaccines that are being made available, but that's just one part of the answer here. And that's what makes this so complicated. And then this is a multi-year challenge. It's not just preparing for the next pandemic, which that work needs to happen now. It's also once we get to the thresholds needed, which is going to take a while at the current pace to reach enough people, get vaccinated enough people in every country, we are going to be looking at our boosters needed. What does that look like, et cetera. So this is a long challenge, much longer than I think people might realize.
If I may add there, Harsha, and Jennifer's right, it's not a silver bullet, the WTO TRIPS agreement. As ever said it has. And I think often it gets mistaken to think that the sort of realists tend to sort of ignore it because they said it's not going to give us vaccines immediately. And I think, as Jennifer points out, I think we can't get confused by the term immediate. When people say immediately, what is immediate? I mean, we're going to live through this for, it's not just this year, it's going to be next year, maybe even the year after. And by some projections, certain low-income countries are not going to see a vaccine until 2023 at the current rate. So by some accounts, people we spoke to, manufacturers in other countries, India, who haven't been given a license even, but they've now been given licenses for actually the Sputnik vaccine, the Gamaleya vaccine, and they're already up and running and rechanging their biologic infrastructure. These are biologic companies primarily, not necessarily vaccines. But even if you think about, I think Moderna just sort of a couple of weeks ago are actually now engaging Samsung Bioepis to do some of their sort of, whether it be fill and finish or what have you. So Samsung is typically a biologics company, doesn't do vaccines. And so I think sometimes there's this idea that, sure, it does take a long time. Having studied vaccine manufacturing on behalf of Gavi, I wrote a paper about developing country vaccine manufacturing capability in 2013 for HPV, pneumococcal. And the idea that intellectual property barrier often gets missed because it is a barrier. You have people like for the pneumococcal vaccine, Pfizer actually challenged when their patents were challenged. Actually, it blocked other manufacturers from getting further down the line. And so what we're saying is actually get a level playing field. Those who can actually get as far as they can support that process. If there's technology transfer, it's a kind of stick and carrot approach, get people to transfer the technology too. All these mechanisms are being set up, at least on a voluntary basis, but no one's really doing it. And just to Jennifer's point, if you look at some of the investor calls that Pfizer's had, they're already looking at a significant market opportunity here. They're talking about pricing their vaccine now $150, $175. And I wonder whether it's in their interest to actually end this pandemic, be given the market opportunities. And so this is the reason why we need more competition in the marketplace, and we need to increase those supplies both for now, immediately, and I say immediate as into the next 3 to 9 months, and some of these manufacturers could potentially get up and running 6 to 9 months, particularly with some solid investment behind them and transfer of know-how. And then we've got the next year ahead of us. So I don't want people to get confused by this, oh, it's not immediate enough. Because I've heard this on every conversation I've had, and I think actually that's actually deflection, to be honest.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Tahir. Perhaps just staying a little bit on this topic, but diving into this technology transfer aspect. Dave, could you tell us about the efforts that the foundation is making to facilitate technology transfer? What do those activities look like, and what kind of timeline are you operating under for translating that into expanded manufacturing?
Yeah, so we've been working together trying to support and help a number of companies and countries with this. As I noted earlier, the country that's the world's largest production of vaccines by far is India. Right? Within that, the Serum Institute of India is the largest manufacturer of vaccines in the world. So we early on worked together with Gavi to help them provide funding in the form of loans, really, to the Serum Institute of India, and to get tech transfers from both University of Oxford, AstraZeneca, their vaccine, into Serum Institute of India, as well as Novavax, two of the leading candidates at that time. And with that, they've been working to manufacture both of those vaccines. Now, at this point in time, of course, any vaccine that's being manufactured in India is largely staying in India to address really the tragic circumstances and the tragic needs and immediate needs that they have. But we've worked on that. We've worked also other activities going on. Johnson & Johnson's vaccine being transferred for filling to Aspen, which is in South Africa, is the world's 6th largest generics producer. And to Tahir's point, has not traditionally been a vaccine producer. When you come to the fill and finish operations where you take the vaccine and put it into a vial, or we call fill, finish, or drug product, that's actually very common to what people do for many biologics around the world. And so that step is probably the one that has the most opportunity to be transferred to non-traditional vaccine producers. We also, through COVAX work early on, there's a lot of concern around, for example, supply limitations. We've all heard about this. To get things like the makers of pharmaceutical glass. They're a very special type of glass. Get them to ramp up their production months ahead of where the vaccine production was occurring, so there would be enough glass to be used around the world. And so those are the type of activities that we've done, working both with individual manufacturers and with COVAX. I think it's more of those types of activities, as Tahir's mentioning, that need to occur and are continuing to occur in order to really ramp up the availability of vaccine supply.
Mm-hmm. And thanks. I'd like to focus on a topic that's come up with regard to expanding supply in the short term, which is shortages of raw materials and supplies. I'm curious to get your take on what's contributing to these shortages. Could you tell us about the relative importance of shortages of raw materials and supplies versus actual manufacturing facilities themselves? Like, what are the binding constraints that you feel are operating here? Do any of you want to address that question?
I think there's a couple of things. We have to, there's two big trends that occurred in the industry that really kind of lead us to contributing to this. So one, of course, is lean manufacturing. Essentially, everyone's been trying to operate under a kind of just-in-time philosophy and to avoid stockpiling materials, et cetera, because it all adds to inventory costs, et cetera. So that's occurred in every industry, and we're seeing the impact of that, across the board. Everyone, students have found supplies of things that they cannot acquire around the world. Two is there's also a move within the pharmaceutical industry, particularly the people who make sterile products like vaccines and biologics, to use disposable use equipment. Right? What this means is rather than having a stainless steel tank that you have to go in and carefully clean over and over again after each batch, you just basically drop a plastic bag inside it, use it for that one batch, then throw that plastic bag away. So single-use equipment. And the third thing is what you mentioned is all glass is going into, all the products basically being filled into glass vials. Vaccine manufacturing around the globe, depending on the estimates you you read has increased probably 2 or 3-fold. Okay, from a base of maybe 5 billion doses a year to, people are estimating, and we can debate the estimates, up to 10 billion doses, 15 billion doses by the end of this year, total vaccines. And the overall industry wasn't ready for a 2 to 3x increase in all those input supplies. As I mentioned, for glass vials, we recognized early on that glass vials were going to be limiting. There are investments made there. Frankly, we missed all the other parts of this. Right, there weren't early investments made to expand manufacturing capacity for these plastic bags or for certain other types of raw materials, filters, and so forth that get used once and disposed of, these single-use components. And that's what we're seeing is limiting vaccine manufacturing in several cases. The absolute magnitude of that impact, I just don't know. I haven't seen a good estimate of how much more vaccine could be made if there were no limitations. I really don't know.
Great. Tahir, yeah. Yeah, please.
No, I think David makes an important point there about the use of bioreactor bags, which these single-use bags. What's been interesting as we've seen this debate happen. I'm just bringing it back to the TRIPS sort of waiver. There's been various sort of reasons why people have resisted those who've defended against using the waiver, and the goalposts have shifted. And one of the things was the lack of raw material supplies. And then if you look at some of the intellectual property landscape around bioreactor bags, it's a consolidated industry. There's a lot of IP around it. And so, each way you look at it, there is an IP barrier. And this is why the waiver should not be just for vaccines. It should be broader, because there's all sorts of IP that plays into the sort of supply chain. We hear about Pfizer talking about the 280 components of its vaccine. Many of those little pieces have IP on it. And in fact, the IP is not just held by one manufacturer or by the actual manufacturer. It's held by different people that you license in, possibly. And I think this is why the waiver is so important. It just opens up the possibilities that we might get other suppliers. Now, of course, I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight, but there may be other possibilities there. And so this idea that raw materials and supplies are just something separate to IP is, again, another misnomer that I think.
Yeah, appreciate that point, Tahir, and thanks, Dave, for sharing the details about the materials and manufacturing processes that are relevant here.
Can I add one thing on that? Just one small point. You asked earlier about preparing for the future, and I think all of this is so important for preparing for the future, because we're sort of rehashing now a lot of the arguments that took place during the AIDS epidemic, some of which got dealt with creatively and made a difference. Others are still there, and so we're having to sort of do this in real time during a crisis. And so to the extent that some of what is done now can lead to change in the future, it could set up for a different response next time.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, I want to look ahead farther into the future, even in a wrap-up question for each of you. I'd like to just perhaps pose a few sort of rapid-fire questions that have come in from the audience, and then maybe have one bigger picture question that each of you could address before we wrap up. So, one question that has been posed here has to do with this most recent announcement about 500 million Pfizer doses that the U.S. plans to purchase and donate. The question there specifically is whether there has been consideration for providing a lot of the necessary cold chain support to ensure that these doses can actually get distributed in low-income countries. Do any of you want to speak to that based on what you've read and heard? Jen or Dave?
I'll start, and then Dave probably knows a little bit more about the COVAX specifics on this, but yes, I mean, I think part of the whole idea of creating COVAX and also some of the efforts that the U.S. has been looking at is how do you bolster the whole system around getting shots into arms, and so that has been a necessary part of the conversation. And certainly is part of what COVAX is trying to set up, but that also requires resources. And for example, I believe the U.S. As part of that, I think I mentioned up top that there's $4 billion that was appropriated by Congress to COVAX. $2 billion was provided for purchasing vaccines. $2 billion that was going to be provided. A portion of that was going to go more to the sort of operational side of things. Now that's all being used for purchase of vaccine. So it is just a limitation on what is being made available compared to the need. So it's definitely recognized. I think yesterday in the White House press briefing about this announcement, they talked about this, and they talked about the need to sort of work with countries to ensure that they could deliver doses. But it is something to be very focused on.
Yeah. Dave, do you feel this is going to be an added challenge to turning the donations into, say, reality?
I certainly it's going to be an added challenge in that the Pfizer vaccine has to be kept very cold at temperatures that aren't standardly found in refrigerators and freezers. This also was, though, and I want to hit some positive notes here, something that was recognized a while back as soon as people are starting to look at that profile and how we distribute it globally. And just to give you an idea that one of the things that's been encouraging out of all this is a number of different companies and countries have stepped up. For example, there are lots of articles, I think, a while back about how we're going to run out of CO2, carbon dioxide, that's used to make dry ice. They keep these vaccines very cold. It turns out, perhaps not surprisingly, that the soda industry uses a lot of carbon dioxide and generates a lot of carbon dioxide. And soda manufacturers around the world have offered to use some of their carbon dioxide manufacturing capabilities to make dry ice. So things like this that are happening, actually, there are a number of really positive things. We've seen companies really coming forward, and countries and public health donors, U.S. government, a variety of people really come forward very helpfully to try to address these issues. It's still going to be a challenge, and so additional support there would be extremely welcome.
Right. Thank you. And then just maybe one or two other questions. One has to do with the sovereign indigenous nations within the U.S.'s geopolitical boundaries, and are they being viewed as part of the announcements that have been made, or are they lumped into domestic efforts? I don't know if Jen.
I can answer that. Yeah, I can answer that. They are definitely viewed as part of domestic U.S. efforts. The Indian Health Service has been working with all federally recognized tribes and indigenous nations, as have states with others. And more than $9 billion, $10 billion has already been provided for many COVID-related efforts. Vaccines are being provided free, as they are to everyone in the United States. So whether disparities are, there's lots of disparities in those communities that predated COVID. In general, in terms of vaccination success, they've been doing quite well. Indigenous nation has been doing quite well in vaccination, but it's all part of the U.S. response domestically, and it's all free, the vaccines.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's terrific. We're just mindful of the time here. I'd like to pose a wrap-up question for each of you, but also before I get there, maybe just a very quick yes, no, maybe kind of response to this question about, we started out with the estimated need for vaccine doses globally and where we are right now. So your level of confidence or belief that it is going to be possible to produce another, say, 8-10 billion doses in the next 2 years. Where do each of you stand on that? Would love to just get a rough check on your pulse there.
I'd say technically feasible. It's really going to depend on the kind of things that Jan's been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Tahir?
I think it would be definitely feasible if we bring in more manufacturers. I think also there's going to be other circumstances which we probably don't. There may be other outbreaks and other issues which we can't. We have to account for, and that's why I think it's important to bring in other manufacturers.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, and Jen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just shows that the answer to this question can't be seen in isolation. So I'm hopeful that, and I agree technically it can be done, but there's a lot of barriers.
Thanks. Well, I found each of your responses to that question still illuminating in terms of at least highlighting what the issues are. So we are nearly out of time here. So I'd like to pose one wrap-up question to each of you, and this also just connects to my broader interest in this topic area of access to medicines and vaccines. So, just looking farther into the future, obviously we are very focused on the current pandemic, but I think many people recognize that there's likely to be a need for potential booster shots. There already are, and there are likely to be new variants. And then, as Jen and I have written about in a paper that was published pre-pandemic, talking about preparedness for pandemics, there are going to be future pandemics as well. And so, with that in mind, I'd like each of you to perhaps maybe think big picture and say, and tell us what is one thing that you feel we should do differently, or what is a mistake that we should avoid so that we are in a position to have greater vaccine supply in those future scenarios, but either for COVID-19 down the road or for future pandemics. And I'll start with you, Jen, for that wrap-up question.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be quick. I mean, there's been a lot of reports already coming out about what needs to be, what went wrong, what needs to be done differently. We've had also up before COVID, lots of preparedness manuals and efforts. So I think what needs to be done differently is what ends up being in place now, whether it's, it's COVAX now and could be mobilized for a future. There's talk about a global financing mechanism in general to address this kind of, that needs to be done yesterday. And to the extent that that is successful, it will hopefully go much further so that when the next pandemic happens, we are not talking about being at this place this far into the outbreak.
Mm-hmm.
So that there are some really specific concrete things that can happen, that can come out of this. So that would be my number one.
Okay, so sort of rethinking like how and when we establish things like,
and creating the mechanism now that then gets carried forward.
Right. Okay. And then over to you, Tahir, for response on that.
Yeah, I think the thing that's really struck me is especially the amounts of public funding, non-private actor funding that's gone into developing a lot of these vaccines. I think we need a more open science platform to actually make these technologies available to anyone and everyone who can actually use them and make them. I think what's really held us back is like really a few actors just holding on to these monopolies. And the monopoly market system doesn't work. And the WHO back in 2015 in its R&D blueprint for pathogens and pandemics said the current market model doesn't work to serve the R&D purposes. And secondly, I think the WTO as an institution needs to be desperately revised, where you have literally the global north-rich countries deciding how the global south can respond to a pandemic. I think that's just...
Mm-hmm. I wonder if this sort of relates to with neglected diseases, there have been proposals made in the past about some sort of price system that's given for anyone that is able to develop a vaccine, and then after that, it's sort of the manufacturing is done in a different way. Is that partly what you're alluding to there, Tahir?
Yeah, anything. I mean, obviously you need incentives, so it could be a part of that. But I think, especially where it's public taxpayers' dollars or even philanthropic dollars, I think, as much as philanthropy helps to bring some of these things to the market, unfortunately, as we've seen with serum, if it gets in the hands of only a few people, we can get these other problems. So we need a much more open science platform where technology is shared much more readily. And I think especially when we see the amount of dollars, I think it's some 100 billion globally that governments have put into getting some of these technologies out there. I think, and yet all the sort of socialize the risk and privatize the gains kind of comes to mind.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, thank you. And Dave, I'd love to get your perspective on this as well.
Yes, I think one of the things, I agree with everything that's been said, but one of the things we also need is to really look at having a better, more regionally distributed vaccine manufacturing system. We have seen that this is highly concentrated in a handful of countries. That leaves us with a very fragile system that's easy to disrupt. But the converse, we cannot go all the way to having 190 facilities, one in each country. That also will not be sustainable. So we have to come up with a regional system that provides for better distributed vaccine production and provides for the healthcare security that so many countries are looking for.
Mm-hmm. And and how far away do you think we are from having that? I mean, obviously, India has been brought up several times, but you also mentioned manufacturing in South Africa. And do you feel like we are we are very far from having that type of regional system in place, or is that gonna?
There's tremendous interest. There's tremendous interest in doing this. There's tremendous enthusiasm for doing it, and with this coming also financing and investments for doing it. So I think it will get started. It's already started. Where people are looking at this quite seriously, and there is a lot of different financing investments afforded. What needs to be done now is to take all that enthusiasm and channel it into ways that will be the most productive for a long-term outcome, and that will take time.
Great. Right. Well, so I think we're basically out of time. I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel, but before I do that, I just want to thank each of you personally for being here, for sharing a lot of your very, very valuable perspectives on this topic. I personally have learned a lot, both from what you shared today, but also encourage people to read what each of you have written and worked on. I think very important and informative for this topic, and thanks for the work each of you are doing as well on this issue. So thanks again. I'll turn it back over to Rachel. Oh, there you are.
Thanks, everyone. I will echo Harsha's thank you to all of you for joining us. A very smart man once said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. I want to thank you all for really outlining so clearly what we've learned through this pandemic and ways in which we can translate that so we're better prepared for the next one. So thank you for participating. Thank you, Harsha, for moderating, and thanks everyone who signed in today. Take care.